Hey, listeners, y'all, I am so excited about my guest today. I know I say that about all my guests, but I'm really, really excited to introduce you to Molly Stillman. Molly is an author, a speaker, a blogger, and podcaster whose deep passion lies in inspiring women to know they were created on purpose, with a purpose, and for a purpose. Her weekly podcast, Can I Laugh on Your Shoulder? Its mission is to make you laugh, cry, and laugh till you cry. I love Molly's podcast, y'all, and I listen to it every week. She also has a memoir coming out soon. If I Don't Laugh, I'll Cry. How Death, Debt, and Comedy Led to a Life of Faith, Farming, and Forgetting What I Came into this room for. Y'all, I cannot wait to read it. And today she's going to give us a peek into her story. And once you meet Molly, I know that you are going to love her too. So, welcome to the show, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me, Carol. I really appreciate it.
So, can you give the listeners just a little insight into like what your family's like now? And then we'll go all the way back to your childhood.
Yeah. So I'm a wife to John, and we have two children here on earth, Lily and Amos. Lily's 10, and Amos is about to be 8.
Mm.
And we have two baby boys in heaven named Elijah and Malachi. And then we live on a small farm in central North Carolina. We have chickens and goats and ducks and geese. And actually, I can look out the window right now, and like my goats are grazing in the front yard. My geese are right outside the window. So we have, farm dogs and a house dog who's under my feet and barn cats. I mean, it's chaos, but we love it, and it's our little slice of heaven. And I plan on. I don't drink sweet tea, but I always say, I'm like, I imagine myself at 95 drinking sweet tea on my front porch. Maybe by then I will drink sweet tea. I'm probably the only North Carolinian who doesn't, but
You probably are. I live in South Carolina. I'm not that far away from, well, I don't know, probably 5 hours because we live in the upstate of South Carolina and you're in Durham, right?
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. But man, sweet tea, you don't know what you're missing.
I know. See, I stick to water and Diet Coke.
Well, the water's really good for you, but
I know,
no
I know,
comment on the Diet Cokes.
I know, I know.
But
But yeah, so that's my life now. And yeah, and I write and podcast, and I speak and serve at my church, and it's a full, beautiful life that I'm really grateful.
well, it sounds like you have a lot of fun no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. If you don't, you fake it very well because it looks like you are. So,
Yes, definitely.
so I want to go all the way back to your childhood, and if you could just share, like, there are so many facets of Molly's life that I know somebody's going to identify with one aspect of your life because you have been through so much in your young life that is, you're younger than 40, and I think people who've lived 90 years have not been through as much life as you've been through. So I just start wherever you want to.
Well, yeah, that is a pretty loaded question. And it's an interesting thing, when I share with people that, that I'm writing, or that I wrote a book and that it comes out in the spring, March 26th, actually,
Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
March 26th. Um, and people ask me like, "Oh, what kind of book is it?" And I say it's a memoir. And 9 times out of 10, I get people that say, "Well, how you're too young to have written a memoir." And it's, it's a fair criticism. I will say that. However, I say you haven't read the book yet, and I say I've lived a whole lot of lifetimes. And it is actually something that I address pretty early on in the book. I make a comment kind of about that, about why I decided to write the book, and why a memoir, and why I felt God calling me to write this particular book at this time. And yeah, the answer is I've lived a lot of lifetimes. So what does that look like exactly? Without obviously giving the whole story away.
Right, right. We want them to buy the books.
But the short, the kind of 36,000 foot view is, so I was born and raised in Northern Virginia in a little town called Herndon, and both of my parents could write, memoirs all on their own with their stories. In fact, my mom did. You should read it. It's called Home Before Morning.
Right. Yeah.
But my dad, I always joke he's too retired to do that. So, but my parents met later in life. It was not they were not their first marriage. They were recovering alcoholics, and they met in recovery. And so I was born into really just kind of unique family circumstances. And but in particular, my mom, her name was Lynda Van Devanter, and she was an Army nurse during the Vietnam War. And that in and of itself, like, people don't realize, how many people served in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
However, and they don't even know the exact number, but estimates say only around 11,000 women served during Vietnam.
Wow.
And so it's a pretty small percentage of people. So
And the Vietnam War went on for
a long
years,
time.
years and years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's not a lot.
And so she came home to a country that, for people who, I wasn't alive, obviously, at the time, but for people that weren't alive at the time, and people that were, remember this, the country was deeply divided, and the military was not celebrated the way that the military is today. There were no welcome home signs. There were no, brass bands, nothing like that. It was, my mom, came home from Vietnam, a very changed person, and she was deeply jaded and wounded and had severe PTSD, and was met with, being called a Nazi pig, and, trash and feces thrown on her, and just the vulgarities hurled at her were wild. And so very quickly she dove into alcoholism, drug addiction, and severe PTSD. But there was no word for that at the time. Nobody knew what PTSD was. And she had such severe PTSD that she didn't even tell her therapist that she had served in Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that would have helped.
That would have helped. And in the first few years after Vietnam, she would go to the VA for help. And the Veterans Affairs Office would say, "Oh no, honey, women didn't serve in Vietnam." I mean, like, literally people would say to her, "But women didn't serve in Vietnam." And it's crazy because people always think like, well, that can't possibly be true. I can assure you that it is. I can assure you.
How did they say that?
I mean, it was such a wild time. And then other fellow men veterans at the time, like, she would go to marches and things like that. And other male veterans would even say, like, "Get out of here. You didn't serve. You didn't see combat," even though, she was in a combat zone. So all that to say is, her story is, pretty wild. And, she published her memoir in, 1983. And it's called Home Before Morning. And it was the very first nonfiction account of the Vietnam War from the perspective of a woman.
Wow.
And it very quickly became, it was a best-selling book, but it was also incredibly controversial. Because it was, I mean, even in the early 80s, there was still a lot of contention and division around Vietnam. And there were even fellow nurses who disassociated themselves from her. And I mean, it was, yeah. And so, and then I was born in 85. And so I was kind of born during this time where she was having to defend herself on 60 Minutes, on, Inside Edition, Nightline, or Dateline, Good Morning America, the Today Show. She would be on these shows, on these interviews, like defending herself, defending her story, because of the attacks that were being hurled at her. And so I really quickly, like, I was just immersed in her world. And I mean, it was kind of one of those things where, like, it was never a question of, did we sit down and have a conversation about my mommy going to war, but more, I was just so immersed in her life. From, she took me everywhere. We did everything together. And so, she would take me to Capitol Hill when she was, testifying in front of Congress. And, I
Wow.
was there in 1993 when she was at she participated in the groundbreaking of the Vietnam Women's Memorial with Colin Powell and John Kerry. And so I'm just this young kid and I'm witnessing all of this, but I'm not really grasping how historical it was, all
No.
these things. Um, and then in the fall of 1994, my mom got sick from a very rare disease that only about 4 other people in the world have ever had, um, due to her exposure to Agent Orange while she was in Vietnam. And so very quickly, I was then dealing with, I was 9 when she got sick. And anybody who's ever had an chronically ill parent or a chronically ill family member or have dealt with chronic illness, it is life sucking in both
Mm.
a literal and a figurative sense. I mean, it sucks everything out of you and your money, your emotions, all of those things. And so, but that was a formative experience,
I'm
having to
sure.
then care for and all the nuances and dealing with my mom being critically ill.
Are you an only child or
So I have an older sister who we're half sisters. She is about 11 years older than me, and we share the same dad.
okay.
So, but and then she was at college by this point. So in some ways I was, and then, but I'm not an only child, but just in that, like during
Well,
this time, I was the only kid at home.
right, yeah.
Um, and so we had a foster sister who was in and out, but it was just one of those experiences where I'm going through those formative teenage years, but I'm having to grow up really fast.
Yeah.
And then in the fall of 2002, so my senior year of high school, my mom passed away after an 8-year battle
Mm.
with that illness. And so that really was the straw that broke the camel's back in the sense that, for me, in the sense that uh, because during that time, and I don't fault my parents for this at all, because I love my parents. That they were fantastic, flawed human beings. But I wasn't really given any emotional or spiritual tools to deal with everything that we were facing and the fallout of her illness over the course of 8 years. And then when she died, I'm a senior in high school.
Yeah.
I have a 5-day old boyfriend, you know,
Wow.
and in a lot of ways, I just shut down, and no one. And again, I don't fault anybody, but it was just it was what it was. Is nobody ever bothered to say, "Hey, you should probably like go see a counselor, or you should talk about this with somebody,"
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
just kind of I think in a lot of ways at the time it was just how we dealt with things as a society. Is it just we didn't really talk about it, and it was just like, I'm gonna act like everything's fine.
Right.
Mm. And so that really was that catalyst of the rest of my senior year of high school. I kind of checked out mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and I was just fine. I was quote unquote fine.
Mm.
And so that really led me down the path to where I really hit rock bottom by the age of 25.
Rock bottom at 25.
Yeah.
That's young to hit rock bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know my dad served in Vietnam too. So,
Oh,
but he was
wow.
there in uh, my brother was born in 66. So he was there from 66 to 67. But yeah, he was a truck driver
Yeah.
and Agent Orange, he ended up with leukemia
Yep.
and was ultimately, he got COVID in 2020. And that was probably the reason that he died from COVID was
Mhm.
because of the Agent Orange. So it has hurt so, so many. And
Yep.
I'm so sorry you lost your mom at such a young age. I mean, that has such an impact. And
Mm,
I'm sure that really helped you hit rock bottom a whole lot sooner than you probably would have otherwise.
100%. Yeah.
So Okay, once your mom died, and did you go to college, or what was your plan for your life at that point?
Yeah, so I did go to college. I went to a small public liberal arts school in Virginia called Christopher Newport University. And, and this is kind of where my story took a different turn than I think a lot of the script writers would have, said. In that, a lot of people, when they're dealing with grief or suffering, there is a common reaction to, or a common thing that you see where people kind of fall into patterns of alcoholism or drug addiction or things like that, like coping mechanisms.
Mhm.
That's certainly not everybody's story, but it's a very common one. That was actually not my story. And I think part of that was because I had grown up in a home with recovering alcoholics. So I
Right.
was, it's not that I didn't drink. It's that I was terrified to ever end up addicted to anything like
Yeah.
that. Never did a drug in my life, never smoked a cigarette. Like I just, I was just around because all recovering alcoholics smoke cigarettes. And
Yeah.
so I was like, yeah. So I was like, it's not my jam. But for me, a lot of my coping mechanisms were success driven and proving everyone wrong, if
Mm.
that makes sense. And it really led me to make decisions based on what I thought other people would think. So I got into just really unhealthy patterns that looked great on the outside. So, in high school, I always say, like, and growing up, I mean, I was bullied a lot in elementary and middle school. And in high school, I kind of found my way, but I would just say, like, I was average. And I
Mhm.
realized that most of us are average. These
Right.
bell curves
That's
exist for a reason.
yeah.
But I was just very average. I mean, I had great group of friends, but I wasn't popular, but I wasn't like despised. I was an averagely good golfer. I was averagely good at singing. And so I did choir. And so I just kind of was never, I was averagely good at my grades. I was terrible at testing. So I had horrible SAT scores, but I was a good writer. And I mean, that's really what I attribute like to how I got into college because I had decently good grades, but I wrote a just killer application essay. And so I know that that's what got me in. Because I wanted to be, I wanted to write in college. And so, when I went to college, it was this chance to like reinvent myself. And so I just dove into, I ran for freshman class president and I rushed a sorority and I was starring in the, and writing in this campus sketch comedy group. And I was just, doing all these things to like make myself feel better and like look great. And it's not that those things were inherently bad, but I think there was a motivation to them that was unhealthy. And I think back to like my freshman year, like I never did the normal like go to college things. Like I didn't really go to parties. Like it wasn't, and not that I don't think that's a bad thing, but I was so focused on I wanted to get really good grades and I wanted to be successful and I wanted to prove people wrong. And so I really pushed into that. And then I fast forward a couple of years, a lot happened. But on the first day, it was like maybe the second day of classes of my senior year of college, which happened to be my 21st birthday.
Oh.
So my 21st birthday was August 23rd, 2006. And yeah, it was like the first or second day of classes. It was a Tuesday. I do remember this. And I was student body president at the time, because that was the track that I was on.
Yeah.
And so I was in my office that morning and the campus mailroom had called and said there was a certified letter that I needed to go pick up. And so I go downstairs to the mailroom and I sign for this certified letter and I go and I don't know what it is. And I open it up and it was a letter from an attorney and a check written out to me in the amount of almost $250,000.
Wow.
And I did what you probably envisioned that I did. And so I go into the longer story of what that was in the book, but In short, it was an inheritance from my mom's estranged family's estate. So my mom's family had become estranged while she was ill.
Mm.
And so I mean, they had completely cut us off from everything. And so I mean, that was not something that was even remotely on my radar. My grandfather had died in 96. My grandmother died in 2004, but nobody had even like told me that she had died.
Wow.
So it had been almost 2 years
What
since she died. What?
what year did your mom die again?
2002.
2002. That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. And so, nobody had told me that my grandmother had died in '04. And essentially, when she died, the estate, the trust, got sold off, and then it was divided between my grandparents' 5 kids, my mom and her 4 sisters. But since my mom was dead, her share went to me. So,
Right.
but again, I was really in no way prepared for
Yeah.
this. And so here I am, getting $250,000 on my 21st birthday, the beginning of my senior year of college. And, nobody told me what to do with it. I mean, I never got and again, and I say this, I feel like over and over in the book, and I say this, I feel like I have to say this a lot, is I don't fault, like my mistakes were my own. I
Mhm.
don't fault anyone. However, with that being said, there are so many times where I think back and I'm like, how not a single person, like at the bank, when I went to the bank, why didn't a single person go, maybe you should talk to a financial advisor? Like
Right.
did that. Nobody did
Right.
that for me.
And
Um,
and so I have to ask, so did you call your dad?
I
Like,
did call my dad, and I love my dad, but he also didn't really give me any advice. He was just kind of like, "Oh yeah, okay, okay, yeah, go down to the bank, and here's how much your tuition is, and you're taking that payment over, and happy birthday." Like it just, I was kind of like, "Okay, what do I do here?" Um, and
uh,
so, once I kind of did the nitty gritty of like, I paid for my tuition. I gave some money to my dad. I gave some money to my sister. And, and then from there, I just was like, I went on a reckless, I just started to make a series of grossly irresponsible financial decisions. And so that became a massive coping mechanism
mm.
where I just spent money and I spent more money and I spent more money and I never thought about it for a second. Um, and I just, it was like reckless abandon, just choices, wildly irresponsible choices. And
But as a 21-year-old,
yeah.
$250,000 would almost seem like an endless supply of
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially when you grow up, like it's not like we did not have money growing up. Like we were not, yeah. Especially when you have an ill parent who can't
Oh,
work. You're
yeah.
so I never had fancy things growing up. And so this was my opportunity to be like, all right, yeah, I'm going to go buy myself that brand new car. Like, yeah, I'm going to fly first class to Rome for spring break. I mean, just like
Wow.
that just, it was just like, yeah, why not? Of course I'm going to do
I
this.
got the
Like,
money.
I got the money, and like you just don't think about it. And and I also like I didn't tell people for obvious reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And so it just became this secret life I was living. And then I graduated college and I moved and I became a high school teacher. And all the while I was, I had big dreams of, I wanted what I wanted to do and when I grew up was I wanted to be a comedian. I wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. And I, just had these big lofty dreams. And so I kept thinking like, I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it. And all the while I'm actually just digging myself into my own burial plot. And then by June of 2008, so less than 2 years later, I had realized that I had not only blown every last cent that I had, but I was over $36,000 in consumer credit card debt.
Wow.
So that moment of realization that I couldn't make minimum payments on my credit cards, that I was like
Uh,
more debt than I made in a year as a teacher. I had a full-blown panic attack. And it was this moment of realization of like, I made a huge mistake and I don't think I'm going to be able to fix this. And I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed. And, but again, like nobody knew any of this. Like my dad didn't know, my sister
Wow,
didn't know, my roommate didn't know.
that's a
Um,
lot of weight to carry.
so much secrecy that I was living. And because I wanted to put on this facade that I was fine and that
Yeah.
everything was great. And I had still like, I'd never dealt with the death of my mother. And
Right.
so
And,
it's
and
just like,
her illness, I mean, I'm sure you had to be fine because your
oh yeah.
mother needed you to be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that moment of like in the panic attack in the fetal position on the floor of my room um was the start of rock bottom. It wasn't rock bottom. It was just this kind of I was on the ledge, if that makes
Mm.
sense. Where I knew that something had to change. But again, like this whole time I didn't know Christ. I wasn't a believer. And so I got connected with a consumer credit counseling agency. And I began the process of trying to get myself out of debt. Yeah, it's just that's the part that's just like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what all you want me to share because there's so much.
Well,
Yeah.
you share what you feel comfortable with sharing. So,
Yeah. So I mean, so that's really what, that was the teetering on the edge of rock bottom for me.
okay. So, how did you dig yourself out of that at 25 years old?
Yeah. Well, so at the time I was 23, or no, I was, let's see, oh wait, I was almost right. Math is hard for me. I don't do
You weren't a math teacher, right?
I was no. Gosh, it's so funny. I have one of my best friends always jokes. She's like, "You're so good at so many things, and you are just wildly terrible at math." I was like, I know," and I don't like sit here and just I count on my fingers, and it's fine.
It's
Everyone,
fine.
it's fine. I remember when because I was so bad at math, and like I was always in math tutoring and stuff like that, trying to pass math. And I remember a teacher telling me, like, well, you're not going to always have a calculator in your pocket. Now I'm like,
That's right.
my smartphone,
Pull that smartphone out.
I can do anything. Yeah,
That's
like
right.
when I play Yahtzee with my kids, they're always like, Mom, why do you always have to add it on your phone? I'm like, because I'm not doing it in my head. It's gonna take me. Anyway, all that to say is I don't know. I was like 23, 24, and or almost 23 in June of '08. So um I moved. So, again, a lot happened during this time, but I began the process of trying to get out of debt. And so I was working as a teacher, but I was selling stuff. I was picking up odd jobs, just doing whatever I could to try and pay off this debt. And again, doing it without like nobody knew the situation I was going through. And
Yeah.
so because I knew it was a mess of my own making. It was, I didn't get into debt overnight, so I wasn't going to get out of debt overnight. And so I had to just own my mistake. And but I thought that I could just shoulder the burden on my own. And so I was paying off the debt. Then by the June of '09, a year later, I moved to North Carolina. And so I moved to North Carolina in June of '09 and from Richmond, Virginia, because that's where I was living before. And again, began that process of, or continued that process of trying to get out of debt. And in the meantime, was in a pretty unhealthy relationship at the time. And emotionally was really teetering on making a decision that was irreversible. By January of 2010, the guy I was dating broke up with me, and I was working 4 jobs
Ah,
trying to get out of debt, 7 days a week. I worked 2 jobs a day. It was as tiring and exhausting as you could imagine.
yeah.
And then I had, just gotten broken up with by this guy I moved to a state for. And
Wow.
um, so that season, like January of 2010 through July June, July of 2010 was my rock bottom. Like I was so emotionally, mentally, spiritually drained. I was, and I regularly contemplated suicide.
Mm. Oh
And because
gosh.
I felt like, because I was I was almost 2 years into paying off my debt, and it just felt like I was still like the light. I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I had no hope. I was just exhausted, and I didn't have a foundation to lean on. I didn't have anybody to lean on because I was shouldering this burden on my own. And then in July of 2010, I started dating my, spoiler alert, now husband. And I knew very quickly, and it was of course like we worked together. And so it was, of course, one of those relationships that came along at a time where like I didn't want a relationship. I'd just gotten out of a pretty bad one. And I
Yeah,
was like,
that's usually how it happens.
always,
Yeah.
always. I mean, I was just like, no, I don't want a relationship, but there was just something different about him. And I came to learn that he was a Christian, and there was just something different about him. Of all the guys I dated before, which I have to say, spoiler alert, my favorite, probably, I don't know if it's my favorite. It's definitely my husband's favorite chapter. But there is a chapter in the book called the boyfriend chapter. And that's literally what it's titled. And it was the most fun to write. I will say that. And where I chronicle all of my relationships from kindergarten up through
Oh my gosh.
after college. And it was the most fun to write because it is like when I really look back at just how absurd it is. But my husband he finds it hilarious because he's like, look, the bar was super low for me. Like I didn't have to do much to, but the reality is that he was just so different, and he was, he called and he texted when he said he would, and
Oh,
like he,
wow.
opened the door for me. I mean, just like basic stuff that I look back and I'm like, this should have been like bare minimum, but it
Right.
was, wildly crazy. Um, but all that to say, he asked the right questions, and he really wanted to get to know me for me. And there was a pretty like pivotal lunch we had, where we were working on an event, and we took a break, we went to lunch, and um we both kind of opened up about, I shared things that I had never shared with anybody. I learned that he had read my mom's book when he was in college.
Wow.
And so there was just so many things that it was this moment where I felt safe for the first time. And then in September, it was actually his birthday, September 26th, 2010. I went to church with him for the first time, and I was terrified to step foot into a church, but
Now, this is the first time ever setting.
no, not ever, but in a very long time.
Okay.
And I was at a very different place, obviously. And so I stepped foot into a church, and kind of the rest is history there. Like it was the first time I'd really ever heard the gospel. It was the first time I was ever like really presented with the hope that can be found in Jesus.
Mm.
And I left that day. Certainly it wasn't like a quick fix silver bullet scheme, but it was I left that day with a glimmer of hope. And really never looked back. And I just dove headfirst into church, and I quickly auditioned for the worship team, and I started tithing. And then by December, I told my husband everything, because I still, or my boyfriend at the time, I told him everything. I told him about my debt and all of that. And instead of like, I was sure, by the way, that he was going to peace out. He was going to run away. He was going to be like, we'll see ya.
Yeah.
Uh, and he didn't. And he opened up his laptop and he started a spreadsheet, and he was like helping me crunch numbers and figure out how I was going to get out of debt faster. And it was the first time like somebody else was willing to stand with me and shoulder some of the burden.
Wow.
And I remember he said, you know, because I was like, I was like, I don't want this to be your problem. Like, this is not your problem. You didn't make these mistakes. I did. And he said in that moment, he said, well, I would like to marry you someday. And so eventually your problems will become my problems. So why not start now? And
Oh, wow. That is so cool.
yeah. And then, we got engaged, the following July, 2011. We got married in February of 2012. We're about to celebrate 12 years of marriage.
Oh, congratulations.
And then in March of 2012, right after we came back from our honeymoon, I paid off the last of my debt and we've been debt free ever since.
Wow. Now, what does your husband do?
Yep. He's a financial advisor, which
Yeah.
is like hilariously, now he wasn't at the time that we met.
Okay.
Um, we both worked in radio. So it's a different story for a different day of how he got into the financial space. But it's funny because about a year or two ago, he had a client, a young kid, come to him who got an inheritance for like a couple $1,000,000.
Wow.
It was like 22, and yeah, it was like it was a very sad story of like his mom had died when he was young, and then his dad died and left him all this money. But I remember my husband being like, so let me tell you a story and what I'm not going to let happen to you. And I was like,
Cautionary tale here.
cautionary tale. But yeah, so that's obviously the short version of a much longer story. But
Yeah,
yeah,
because I mean, that's pretty long still. I
I know.
mean, of
I
everything
know.
that
I'm
you've
always
been
like,
through.
how much time you got?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's kind of shift a little bit towards where you are now as far as how you got into blogging and your podcast and speaking and now writing your book. And by the way, I love the cover of the
Thank
book.
you.
Did you design it or did the publisher?
No, the public, they hired a like outside design firm, but and I will say, and I love my publisher so much. I remember the first draft of a cover that they sent to me, and I was like, no, this is not. Nope, I don't like it. I don't like it. And so the cover we ended up with, I love. I really, really love it. And I kind of fought for having that picture on the cover.
So tell me the story of the picture.
I know it's just this kind of iconic childhood photo of me, and I don't know really like where it was taken but it's just I love it because one, it is this iconic photo of me as a child, but also it's one of those faces where you're like, am I about to cry or am I about to bust out
Yeah,
laughing?
you can't tell. So it
No.
goes perfectly with the title of the book.
Exactly. So that was why I really, really wanted that picture on the cover. And so, yeah, I love the cover. Yeah, the publisher hired a fantastic outside studio to design it, but I'm so happy with how it turned out.
It's
And
very attention grabbing. So I
yeah,
love that. Yeah.
really, really pumped about it. But yeah, so as far as like how I got into writing, so I mean, my mom was a writer. I was always a writer. I loved to write. I was a writing major in college, and so I was writing in some form or fashion for most of my life. But I remember a professor I had my freshman year of college said to me, the only way you will get better at writing is to write. And you have to write really poorly in order to get better.
Yeah.
And so this was at a time like blogs weren't really a thing. This was 2003.
Oh,
And
no.
so I started a live journal. And so I would blog, I would write on live journal. And
I've
I would
never even heard of that.
right, exactly. People who are millennials will probably know what live journal
Okay.
is. But it was a brief period where I would write on live journal, and I don't even know what I would write there. I would just write and just put stuff on there. It was everything from stream of consciousness to like, I had a brief dream of writing for The Onion. It's like a satirical online newspaper. So it's a quote unquote news source, but it's all satire.
Okay. Kind of like the Babylon Bee, sort of?
Yes, yes. So it
Okay.
was the Babylon Bee before the Babylon Bee came around. So
Okay.
yeah, The Onion is like the original of that. The Babylon Bee is kind of like a Christian version of The Onion.
Okay.
So I wanted to write for The Onion, and so I mean, I was like, I think I just wrote a lot of stuff there, and I just wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I mean, like I said, I look back and I'm like, what did I write? But I just wrote and I housed everything, ideas that I had. I mean, I would just write and so I started, and then I moved it over to WordPress when WordPress became, kind of came around. And then, I would just house all of my ideas and my crazy sketches and all these things on there. Um, and then it began to evolve as my life did. And it became more of a lifestyle blog when I would, when I moved to North Carolina and I was getting out of debt. And so I just started writing about my life. And pretty soon, I noticed that people were reading it that weren't, my dad.
Yeah.
um, and so I was, but I didn't know what I was doing as far as like, this wasn't on my radar that I could like do this as a job.
Yeah.
But I eventually started monetizing it in 2012. And then by 2015, I was able to leave my day job and do it more full time. And then in 2016, the summer of 2016, I started my podcast. And that I had wanted to do for years. Because like I said, I'd worked in radio and I like the medium of being able to talk to people and interview people. And I knew it was a skill that I had. And so I started my podcast in the summer of 2016 and been doing it ever since. So, and then, I'd traveled and done speaking and, cause I have a background in theater and sketch comedy and lots of public speaking. And I've just always really liked that as well. And so now it's just the venues have changed. I speak at a
Yeah.
lot of churches and conferences and things like that. But it's probably my favorite thing that I get to do is when I get to actually go and be with people in person and either share my story or do some Bible teaching. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. And yeah, so that's where I am now.
So, having listened to a lot of your podcast, you live in New York for a while and do improv and things like that?
I never lived in New York. I
Okay.
would go for extended periods of time. So I have a cousin who lives and works in Manhattan.
Okay.
And so I would go and stay with her for extended periods of time, like over winter breaks and summer breaks. And I would take classes at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater and the Second City Training Center and the People's Improv Theater. And yeah, so I mean, because that was the goal was I wanted to move to New York. And so I would, like I said, I would go and stay with my cousin. I did stay when I was there for a really extended period of time. I stayed in a hostel, an
Sounds sketchy.
$8 a night hostel
Wow. I can't even imagine what that would look
on
like.
Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was a wild experience staying there. And I look back and go like, how did I not get murdered? In this $8 a night hostel. But I was taking these intensive classes where it was like every day for, 2 or 3 weeks. And getting training. And yeah, I met Amy Poehler and Jeff
Oh,
McNair
wow.
and Ed Helms and Rob Riggle. And I, took classes with just Chris Gethard and these like amazing improvisers. And it was a really cool experience. Yeah. And I mean, it's another story for another day. It was like why I look back now and it was God clearly like keeping me from moving there for a variety of reasons, but never actually got to achieve my dream of moving there, even though now I look back and I'm so glad that didn't
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Thank God for unanswered prayers, right?
Exactly.
So when you started, because I know you started blogging kind of on a whim, I guess, sort of, and then started your podcast in 2016, and now your ministry. So what's the heart of your ministry? What do you feel like your call is that God's put on your life?
Mm. I mean, at its essence, I really feel like I look back on the winding, weird journey that God took me on. Um, and I know, and I'm confident now more than ever um, that God brought me through that journey for a reason. And that reason is one, to show people the source of true joy.
Mm.
Happiness is fleeting.
Yeah.
Happiness is a circumstantial, momentary feeling, whereas joy is a heart posture.
Mm.
Joy is the source of of who we are and who God is within us. Joy is joy in the midst of horrible circumstances, and finding what the source of joy is, and then also purpose. And so understanding like what our purpose is day in and day out, why we get up and do what we do, and why God has continued to put breath in our lungs. Because I was, like I said, I mean, I walked through the first 25 years of my life just so unbelievably blind to the hope that could be found in Christ. And I just wish that I'd heard the gospel sooner. And I know that wasn't my story for a reason. But my hope and my prayer is that I can, minister to people who don't know him. I mean, obviously I hope to minister to people who do. But I have a huge heart for people who are far from the Lord and who don't know the Lord, and who, are in a lot of ways in a similar place to where I was. So yeah, that's the heartbeat of what I do.
Well, I love it. So as we wrap up here, I usually like to ask my guest, and I'm sorry, I'm springing this on you. So,
Hey, all right, I'm ready.
so this will be just, off the top of your head. But say there's somebody out there listening that is going through some of the same experiences that you went through. Because again, you've been through a lot of different experiences, and they are just losing hope, and they don't know that there's any future for them. Maybe they already know Jesus, but they still don't know that there's any way that they can see a future for themselves. So what message of hope would you give to them?
The first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question, and maybe this is not an answer you would have expected, but I think it's actually timely. So the day we're recording this, in my chronological reading plan, we started the book of Job today.
Yes, I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah. And Job, I feel like we really learn a lot about God, about ourselves, and about suffering. And I actually really love the book of Job. Because the beginning is so like wild, like imagining this conversation between God and Satan is just a bizarre thing. But you see the suffering that befalls Job, and how he is facing such suffering, and he then for the next 38 chapters or whatever is just crying out to God. But he never curses God. But he cries out to him over and over and over again. And I mean, there's countless examples of this through the Bible, but this one, like I said, it's just top of mind, is that like God is not afraid of your emotions. You cannot scare God away. It's okay if you're angry, like he can handle it. He can handle whatever you throw at him.
Yeah. Amen.
He can. But one of my favorite chapters in all of scripture, and I believe it is, I don't have my Bible right in front of me at the moment, so forgive me, but I want to say it's like chapter 38, 39, somewhere in there. But it basically, God lets Job just like cry out for 37 plus chapters. And it's almost like, I especially when you get in the middle of Job, it can get a little hard because it's like, okay, I feel like I've read this. Like you've said this before, Job, and Job's friends. But you get to the end and God's like, are you done? Are you done?
Yeah.
And then my favorite, like I said, it's my favorite chapter. It's probably like chapter 38, 39, where God is just like, you're done? Okay, cool. And then just proceeds to mic drop all over Job, where he's like, were you there? Were you there when I taught the deer, how to forage for themselves and feed themselves? Were you there when I created the oceans? Were you there when I hung the stars in the sky? Like, were you there when I set the seasons into place? Like, and it's just this like thing after thing after thing of like all these things that God has done and how he has been there through all of Job's suffering. And like, he is in control. He is sovereign over everything. We might not have, we will never on this side of heaven have the perspective that God has.
No.
But he is sovereign and he is in control and he is good. And so it's a reminder. It's a beautiful reminder to me is that and then this is my encouragement to anybody who's ever going through something. Cause I mean, it's not like since I got saved that I haven't experienced suffering. Cause I can tell
Oh,
you,
absolutely. Yeah.
um, but it's a reminder of when we are suffering, when we're going through hard times, we have to, and this is hard because this is not what the world tells you. We have to take our eyes off of ourselves. We
Yeah.
have to take our eyes off of ourselves and put it onto God and remind ourselves of who God is, what his attributes are, what the promises that he has made are, that he is good, that he is faithful, that he is sovereign, that he is almighty, he is powerful, he's our protector, he's our guide, he's our shield. Like he has given us his word to be a sword. We can put on the full armor of God. There's so many things that like he promises that he will never leave us, that he will never forsake us. 365 times throughout the Bible, he says, do not fear.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I think it's First Timothy 2:7 or Second Timothy 5:7 or something, where it's like, God does not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of sound mind.
Yeah. One of my favorites.
Yes. And so it's a reminder. We have to remind ourselves of who God is and who we are not.
Yeah.
It's not what the world says. That is not what the world says. And I'm not saying that you don't, you know, feel your feelings and feel those emotions and grieve. That is not what I'm saying, because you should absolutely do that.
Right.
And then to move forward is you focus on who God is.
Mm.
And so that's my encouragement to people, because I can tell you, like, I can testify to this. That is how I've been able to come through really difficult seasons, stronger on the other side.
Mm. That is really, really good. I interviewed a guy yesterday. He's a pastor, and I was listening to one of his things on YouTube. And one of the things that he said that I meant to bring up in the interview yesterday and I forgot was that what a gift that God gave us by giving us his word so that we can know him and we can understand him better. I mean, even though we'll never understand him fully. And I'd never thought about that before. It truly is a beautiful gift. And if we'll just dig in, and I'm doing the Bible recap. Are you doing that? Yeah. So a lady had recommended it, said it changed her life. And I'm like, okay, this is what I'm doing this year.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to what God's going to do through teaching me more about him through these scriptures and reading through the whole Bible. So I
Amen.
appreciate you sharing that. That is, I know, very heartfelt.
Thank you.
So Molly, tell us again when your book comes out.
Yes, it comes out March 26th, 2024. And you can pre-order it now. I would love it if you would pre-order it now, and you can get it wherever books are sold. So
Okay.
Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Target, Walmart, anywhere you buy a book, you can pre-order it now. And then that way, and a couple of things that people don't know is, like, one, pre-orders are really, really helpful, but two, you don't get charged till the book ships.
Right.
You're guaranteed like whatever the lowest price is between now and then. So like if it goes on sale, which sometimes like Amazon will run sales or Barnes and Noble will run sales, like you get the lowest price and then it'll be delivered on the day it comes out. So
Yay. So that's awesome. Yeah.
if I don't laugh, I'll cry.
Yeah. And go over to your podcast, Can I Laugh
Yeah.
on Your Shoulder, which I just love how you've rebranded all that. I think it's great. And then if people want to follow you on social media, what is your social media?
Yeah, I'm at Still Being Molly, wherever you get your socials. So
Okay.
in all the places.
Well, awesome. Well, I wish you the best of luck with your book release and with your continued ministry. And you are brightening days all over the world, I know. And you brighten my day. Every time I see it come up in my podcast feed, I'm like, oh, yay, Molly's got a new podcast.
That's really sweet of you.
So I really enjoy it. And I encourage all the listeners to go and listen to it now.
Thank you so much, Carol.
All right. Thanks, Molly.